before we go too far, I just want to make sure you understood what our last discussion was all about. We have Islam that really dominates the Middle East from 650, way back. The problem is that we say the religion dominates, but when we talk about Islam, do we talk about a single entity? No. Lots of different groups. And from the beginning, what you have really are the Shia and the Sunni. Do you remember which of these? These are the biggest differences.
So the Sunni would be the sun and
Tradition and practice. Tradition says son follows the father. Right? But practice, the guy who's the best Muslim, means that the best lieutenant should follow. That makes sense? Muhammad dies, who does it go to? Does it go to the son? Does it go to his best lieutenant? Well, the best Muslim ought to be able to have a voice, or you follow a tradition. And so right off the bat, we have two groups, and don't get me wrong, these guys fight each other. There's a concept that you guys know about, right? Jihad. I didn't talk too much about the theology of Islam. I'm gonna talk about it here. I don't know if you know this, but we have Judaism, monotheism, obviously, and then we have Christianity. We talked about this already. Christianity is different from Judaism because Judaism is looking for the Messiah, and what does Christianity believe?
they found it.
That Christ is the Messiah. That's it, right? Super easy. Well, this, 2000 BC, and then here, literally, that's the beginning of our dating system. Off in Saudi Arabia, when Muhammad appears, Muhammad is about 600 years later. So, I like to just say 650 because that's when it's done. Is he influenced by Judaism and Christianity? Of course he is. He's also influenced by paganism. This is what the people at the time know. And so the Quran is called the recitations. The Quran. This is what the angel Gabriel was supposed to be telling Muhammad. Now you guys don't know this, but Muhammad's not sitting there with a pen and paper writing it down. The angel Gabriel speaks to him over a course of like 30 years. He never writes anything down. His followers remember. He has them. He says this is what they said. They remember word for word. The Arab kind of tribal culture is very, very oral based. Oral traditions. It's not written based. So they end up writing it down as he's dying. Right? Later. That's the Quran, the recitations. This is what he said. That makes sense? Basic argument, there's 5 pillars. I'm not going to go into too much of the detail. The basic argument, though, is submission to God. This is important in terms of a historical perspective, because if everybody submits to God, then whose law always trumps? God's law or man's law?
God's law.
God's law. Always. Total submission to God. This is, and I know you've heard this term today, this is what that basis, the concept of Sharia law is. What does that really mean, Sharia law? It's the law of the religion, religious law. You have religious police. You get off the plane in Iran, and there's a religious police officer right there. If you're a girl, you immediately put on the outfit. You go to jail, you get abused, you whatever, if you don't have it. It's not a matter of faith. In the West, we have separation of church and state from the beginning. It's kind of part of Christian theology. Our treasure is not of this world. It's part of Christian theology. Go ahead.
Didn't Constantine kind of mess that up and try to...
No, not at all. No. What Constantine did, no, it's a very good question. Very good question. No, what Constantine did was made Christianity legal. And immediately he called in all the bishops to Nicaea to have a council.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
And he talked to the Pope. He said, I am the leader of this world, of the political world. You are the leader of the church, and we are separate. This is Constantine saying this. It's a very, very old tradition, and it's a theological basis because our kingdom is not of this world. Christianity is very clear. We're not of this world. Separation of church and state. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. Render unto God what is God's. In Islam, there is no separation of church and state. This is really important to understand. That's what the whole concept of Sharia law. You have a strong political state, then your religious leader is the natural political leader. That's kind of why you had this big debate right off the bat between the Sunni and the Shi'a. Because the Sunni said, well, the political leader ought to be the son. The son follows the father. Muhammad's son ought to be the leader. That's tradition. And then the orthodoxy guy said, no, the guy who's most Muslim, his lieutenant, he's the one that ought to be the next leader. Instant, boom, conflict. Now, we look at this in hindsight and we say, well, this really isn't much more kind of than a tribal conflict, right? And that's exactly what was in Saudi Arabia before Muhammad. This does not go away. But one of the ways that Muhammad was able to grab all the different tribes is God's law above all other laws. Total submission to God. That means that there is no separation of church and state. This is really important. No separation of church and state. That's what this concept of jihad means. In Christianity, Jesus dies, he saves you. He dies so that you don't have to. Very strong sense of salvation. Even in Judaism, this Messiah is the pathway to salvation. Salvation is critical to Judeo-Christianity. In Islam, there is no salvation. You follow God's rules. Total submission. If you follow God, then you are alive. Does that make sense? What if you don't follow God?
They didn't have a soul, something.
You're dead. Now, Islam also, modern Islam is different. We'll talk about this. There's a difference between Shia and Sunni. Modern Islam is different, but there's no free will in Islam. No free will. It's part of the total submission. There's no free will. God has absolutely total control. You have no free will. So pause for a second and connect the dots. Total submission. You have no free will. If you are following God, you are alive. If you're outside, you are dead. What does it mean if you are outside? What's the term that we use? If you are an infidel. You're outside, you're not following God, and you're dead. But you are still walking and talking. What does it mean? Spiritually dead. There's no salvation. Go ahead, Jason.
It's that there's no chance for you.
There's no salvation. There's no chance for you. So you are basically dead man walking.
Oh, wow.
So if you kill the dead man walking, have you killed anybody?
You don't have to.
You understand that? Jihad then is a holy war. Now, long time since 650s to the present day. And yet, total submission, no free will. The Shiite folks would say nothing has changed. Because it's all about practice. The Sunni folks would say, well, sometimes things change. We don't quite believe in in the jihad quite so much as, they may have in the past. Which of these two groups is going to be more receptive to Western traditions? Clearly. Just screaming clearly, right? When I asked last class about Turkey, why was Turkey, I said Turkey is most influenced. Physically, you see that they're right there. It makes sense. But what also? What's the other example about Turkey? What is their religious? They are mostly Sunni. They are tradition-based, not the practicing. Same too, by the way, with over here in Spain. What about the people here in Saudi Arabia region? Sunni or Shia mostly? That's the birthplace, absolutely, is Shia. What about over here in what would be modern day Iran and Iraq? Mostly Shia, but it's right in the middle of things. And this is a double problem, right? Because it's right in the middle of things, do we have unanimity? Do we have a strong political state? Constantly fighting. In the midst of this, we also throw in a couple of groups. The Sufi. Who are the Sufi? Kind of like mystics. And they are all over the place. They're not bound by any particular region because they're also not dominant. They're just minorities. Think of them as the guy who lives in the cave, right? Who is the hermit that lives off in the cave. That would be more of the Sufi mysticism. We also, however, have Kharijites. And Kharijites, today we don't call them Kharijites, we call them Wahhabists. And this is starts off in the 1800s. What's a Wahhabist? Ultra-Orthodox. Not just Shia, but ultra-Orthodox. And so they are totally in favor of the whole jihad thing. Very traditional. The thing is that very traditional really translates into very political, because there's no separation of church and state. So when you're making a religious expansion, aren't you also making a political expansion? And if you are in a region that's very fragmented, who is going to be the guy who's most wanting to unite them? It's going to be more of the Wahhabists. Okay. Is this have a big impact on the Middle East?